Hi, this is Misha, and today's video is on the Russian Tokarev pistol series and its variants and kind of related guns. And that's why I've got a Russian 1895 Nagant revolver in my hands. Now, before the Tokarev was adopted, this was the standard issue sidearm in first Imperial Russia and then later Soviet Russia. And these would actually be kept in production through World War II and wouldn't actually be retired. I mean, I was in Russia about 12 years ago, and some of these are still being issued to like railway police and whatnot. So they stayed on hand with law enforcement for a long time. This is a pretty simple, durable revolver. It fires 7 rounds out of a cylinder here. It is double, single action. It fires 7.62 by 38 Nagant. It does not have a swing out cylinder. Instead, it has a loading gate. Very traditional there. Very just old style of doing things. If you've seen our Swedish video, you know. Slide up there. There you go. You have to rotate it manually to eject your rounds. Put this back. It's often joked that you could fix anything on these with a hammer. They are very simple, durable. One odd feature of the Nagant revolver is that when you pull the trigger, or excuse me, pull the hammer back, the cylinder goes forward and makes a gas seal with the barrel. When you let the trigger go, it recoils back. The idea was to increase velocity. This was only partially successful. Yeah, this was standard issue in Russia. But in 1930, the Revolutionary Committee for the military put out a request for a new handgun. And by 1931, they were already having trials. And it was kind of clear from the very beginning that Fyodor Tokarev's design was going to win. I mean, he was an early favorite. He was liked by Stalin. And it was very clear. So by 1931, the Tokarev pistol, designated as the TT33 or Tula Tokarev, was accepted into service. Now, this is not a TT30. I don't have one. This is a 1942 wartime production TT33, which replaced the TT30 around 1935, 1936, and was basically an updated design that was simplified for mass production. When Tokarev designed his pistol, he used the Browning Model 1903 and 1911 as a basis, but he made it as simple as possible. At the time, Tula basically had horizontal and vertical milling machines. They had lathes, and they had 30 caliber barrel making tools. That's what they had on hand, so pretty old tooling. So he designed his pistol to work with what they had. He didn't use any screws in the design, not even the grips. He used a lot of flat springs and split pins too, like there's a split pin that retains the firing pin and whatnot. So he made it as simple as possible. After a few early teething things with heat treatments and whatnot, in around 1933, these went into mass production and started to replace the 1895 Nagant. And when 1941 rolled around, when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, about 600,000 of these were in service. But as the Nazis pressed on, the Tula factory was threatened, and in late 1941, it was basically dismantled and hauled across the Ural Mountains and then reassembled in 1942 in a safe area. We've got a blog article covering all these details, so I'm not going to go too in-depth on this video. And that brings us to where this gun was made. This was made in 1942 in the middle of the war. It has very rough finish. It has slab wood grips. And this is actually a vet bringback from Vietnam. So that's why it's in, the condition it's in. It's actually mechanically very solid. It's a basic single action only gun. The only safety is this half cock here. There's no manual. And it fires the 7.62 by 25 TT cartridge, which was basically a souped up 7.63 Mauser round. In the 1920s, the Soviets purchased quite a few C-96 broom-handle Mausers and liked the cartridge, and they basically souped it up to fire out of this pistol. And this also allowed them to keep the whole 30 caliber barrel. We do have a manual slide release here, and this disassembles very easily, much like a 1911. The trigger pack is actually a unit, which is nice for replacing things. It feeds from 8-round magazines. And interestingly, the feed lips are not part of the magazine. They're actually part of the hammer group. So if you even had a dented or damaged magazine, there was a pretty good chance it would work because it didn't have to worry about the feed lips being misshapen. When they were designing the Tokarev and when they were making it, they wanted something as simple and easy to produce and to use and to maintain as possible. It was a sidearm for a conscript army. That's exactly what it ended up being. During the war, they would produce these simplified versions with the wood grips. They would continue that from 1942 till 1944. And as the war would end, they would finally kind of return to pre-war standards. Right here, I have a 1946 example that has the original style lined grips with the Soviet star in them. Now, in 1946, they introduced these finer slide serrations as opposed to the large ones on the other pistol. And the reason they did that is Tula and Izhevsk was receiving new machinery there that was capable of machining in that pattern, and it was faster and easier. Otherwise, you just have better bluing. Still feeds from an 8-round mag. The lanyard loop at the base of the mag is kind of gone away from about this point. There's still a lanyard loop on the side of the grip, though. Now, this is an earlier import. It does have a safety in the back. These are required to be added for import purposes to make them safe for Americans. But the original guns wouldn't have had a safety. I never even played with that one. The Tokarev would be in production in Soviet Russia until 1954, and by the end of production, over 1,700,000 would have been turned out. So a very large number. This was standard issue throughout the Red Army. It eventually did completely replace the Nagant after the war, although the Nagant stayed in production during the war. And these would stay in frontline military service into the late 50s, early 60s, and then they would kind of be retired out to second line and law enforcement and whatnot. There's not a lot to say on the gun. It's simple, durable, it is powerful, but it's one thing. It's a very powerful gun, very reliable. I personally really like the ergonomics of the Tokarev. It's just a very simple, utilitarian gun. They're a lot of fun to shoot, too. Now, after World War II, much like what they did with the Mosin Nagants and the AK-47 and the SKS, the Soviets forced, whatever you want to say, production of the Tokarev to many of their Warsaw Pact allies. For example, here we have a Polish, and some sources call this a WZ-33. Others call it a WZ-48. In 1948, Poland was one of the first nations to adopt a version of the Tokarev, and they would keep these in production through the mid-50s. The early ones would have grips with the Radom logo, the FB Radom logo on them. Later ones, like this one, just have standard slab-sided grips. This is an exact copy of the earlier Tokarev with the large serrations on the slide. It does have typical Polish quality, which is great. Pretty nice trigger on this one. It does have the lanyard loop on the base plate of the magazine. Still fires from an 8-round mag, nothing surprising there. And this would be standard issue in Poland well through the 1960s and even up until the early 80s. But yeah, you see that. In Romania, they would also make a version, but they would copy the fine slide serration version, and it would be called the TTC, or TT33 Tokarev. Those would go into production in the early 50s, and actually would stay in standard frontline Romanian service until at least 1991 with the fall of communism. China would have two versions, the Type 51, which is built with some Russian parts, and the Type 54, which was all Chinese. And North Korea would actually make a version called the Type 68, but there's not much known on that. Hungary would do a version called the 48M, which was a copy of the late style with the fine serrations. I've had them in the past. They're quite rare though, so I've had to move them on. They look identical to the Russian, except instead of having the star on the grips, they have a Hungarian wheat and chaff crest. But very interesting. The only 48Ms in the country that I'm aware of are Vietnam bringbacks and a few oddballs that might have snuck across the border from Canada. They've never been officially imported. One country that took the Tokarev but kind of made it its own was Yugoslavia. Zastava began to produce these as the M57 in 1958. And while they started with the late style Tokarev as inspiration, they did make some changes. For example, they dovetailed this front sight and they added this slide ridge here, sight ridge on the sight. It also has a very nice Yugoslavian crest on the top. They went to a full-length guide rod here. Slide release is virtually the same, a little bit different. Now the magazine release is much larger than on other Tokarevs, and it's dished in, so it's a little easier to grasp and press. The biggest change, though, was the magazine. Whereas the other Tokarevs used 8-round mags, the M57 used an extended 9-round mag. So you have one more shot. That also gives you a longer grip, which many Americans find ergonomic. Now this one is of course an import. I haven't seen a non-import M57. There's probably one or two out there, but they're very uncommon. Has a kind of a Browning style safety they added instead of the frame style here. Probably a better safety. In addition to the half cock, the M57 also had a magazine disconnect safety. So I'll show you. I don't know about that. Can't pull the trigger unless you have your magazine in. That's kind of unique to the M57. Now, to go along with that, Zastava kind of ran with the Tokarev design. This is one example. This is the model 70, and this is chambered for 7.65 32, but it's a baby Tokarev. It has the same removable trigger group back here, or hammer group back here. Now, these do have a safety, and this is original to the gun because these were mostly issued to police and high-ranking military officers. They thought having a safety would be a good idea, whereas the M57 had the two safeties I just showed you, the automatic ones. It's like a scaled-down version. Get this back here. I gotta keep looking it on. That safety does like to come on. It has a shorter guide rod, it has a shorter barrel. The barrel isn't fixed to the frame, but it's not a tipping barrel. It's not a locked breech like the Tokarev because of the weaker cartridge. It is still a single action trigger. And it still fires from an 8-round mag, although the mag looks rather different from other Tokarev mags. No lanyard ring on these because again they were police issue. It does have the oversized mag release though. Tokarevs have come in small batches. There's a few Russians that came in early on, but they're quite uncommon. Most of the ones you'll find will be Chinese up until recently. About 10 years ago, Romanian, Polish, and Yugoslavian ones began to be imported. I remember when the first M57s came in, I was really thrilled because you didn't see any of the Yugoslavians, and they were kind of an odd variant. More recently, they've begun to dry up again. You'll see a lot of Tokarevs anymore. If you do, they're usually the Romanian variant, which are perfectly good, but typically the Polish have better fit and finish. Well, these aren't Tokarevs, but I figured we'd mention them since they're kind of fitting. Now, we have a couple of videos on Czech firearms already, and there's a trend with their guns. They like to do their own thing. They don't like to just straight up adopt versions of Russian guns. For example, they adopted the Vz.52 rifle and the Vz.58 rifle instead of the SKS and AK-47. After World War II, they had kind of a hodgepodge of handguns in service. The Vz.24, Vz.27, Vz.38, and the P.38. Well, the Ministry of the Interior wanted a .32 caliber, small caliber gun for police use and clandestine use. So you basically had two brothers, I'm not going to try to pronounce their name, develop a version sort of based on the PPK, but not really. And this is what this is. This is the Vz.50. Obviously, it came out in 1950. It is a double single action gun, firing 7.65. Simple blowback gun. No release for the slide, just has a hold open. Very standard there. Fires from an 8-round detachable mag. Has this kind of Bakelite type floor plate. Have Bakelite style wraparound grips, very reminiscent of the PPK. Also, like the PPK, it has a Browning style mag release, and it has a decocker safety, but instead of being mounted on the slide up here is on a Walther, it's mounted on the frame, as you can see. Internally, there's some other differences. Also, takedown is different. Instead of having a hinged trigger guard, the trigger guard is part of the frame, and there's this button. You just press this button, hold it down, pull your slide back and off. The first ones of these were made from 1950 to 1952, and then another batch was made at what we call today CZ from about 54 to 56, and then they would make some more on and off until 1970, when this would be replaced by a more updated version that we'll get to in another video. But this is nothing to do with a Tokarev, but it is what inspired the next gun that was used. Now, that Vz.50 was mostly for police use, although high-ranking military officers sometimes had it. But this here, the Vzor 1952, was made for military use, and it had the same designers as the Vz.50. Work on this gun actually began back in the late 1940s, and it was known as the CZ-482. And at that time, it was chambered for 9x19 parabellum. It's an interesting gun because it uses a roller-delayed blowback operating system. It doesn't use the tipping Browning-style locked breech barrel. You can see the cutouts here. It rides on this. Well, around 1950, 1951, there's no slide release either. I'm just going to have to drop it. It'll probably spring forward. It likes to do that on this gun. There we go. 1950, 1951, the communists really took complete charge in Czechoslovakia, including of the military. And they demanded that what was at the time, I think it was called, the next version was called the 491 or 493, which was still a 9x19, be reworked to fire 7.62 by 25 Tokarev, which resulted in the CZ-513, which was the prototype version of this gun here. That went into trials and was quickly adopted in 1952 and went into production a short time later, and they had basically one giant production run ending in 1956 where they made over 200,000 of these pistols. So they made a large number very quickly. You'll see that same kind of production technique with the Vz.52 rifle. It was a good gun and that it was well made. The Tokarev round did make it powerful. We do have a last round hold open, but as you saw, there's no release, and oftentimes once you pull the mag out, it likes to go forward. We have a safety, very much like on the VZ50 pistol. It does have a decocker. Activate that for you, why not? It is single action only. And I'm not going to dry fire this for a simple reason. Although these were well made, they were over complex and they started to have issues. One issue was they liked to break firing pins very easily. Another issue, this decocker safety would actually fail, so when you went to decock it, if it was worn, you would actually fire your pistol. There were also problems with the rollers cracking, and there's also a problem with the chamber cracking at its bottom because the steel was too thin there. They weren't great guns. They really weren't. Even by the late 50s, the Czech military wanted to replace them, but they did not have the funding to do so. So as kind of a stopgap measure, they instituted regular and mandatory checks for these, where these would be brought into unit armorers and arsenals and looked at and have kind of parts replaced as needed. So with thorough maintenance, they kept these in service until the 1980s. But they weren't a great gun. And it's not really the fault of the designers so much, although they are very over-engineered for what they are. But, you know, going from being 9 by 19 to 7.65 by 25, they were just dicked around with a lot, and it just, they weren't what they should have been. And I think they were more interested in adopting something made in Czechoslovakia than they were in adopting something that was better. I think the Vz.52 rifle and the Vz.58 are great guns. The Vz.61 Scorpion is a great gun. The Vz.50 pistol we looked at was okay, but it was a little bit finicky too, because it was a little complicated for just a little blowback gun. So it had some reliability issues as well and was ammo sensitive. So they would have probably been better served by just adopting a version of the Tokarev as Yugoslavia, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and others did, but that wouldn't have been very nationalistic. So this is where they got to have an internally designed Czech gun as their standard service weapon. And this served alongside the Tokarev throughout the 50s, and would actually remain in service, as I said, up through the 80s. So it was probably one of the last Tokarev chambered guns to actually go out of service. Then again, it was one of the last to go into service as well. But yeah, this was just a little look at the Russian Tokarev. I didn't want to get into too much detail. Again, we have a blog article with step-by-step history of what happened. But it's a really neat gun, and I really enjoy shooting them. I bought my first one about 15 years ago. It was a Chinese gun. And I've been happy to see more and more of the originals come in. Even if they have to have an added safety, it's not the end of the world. I wish they didn't, like this one here. That's ridiculous and it does nothing. In fact, don't trust an added safety on a Tokarev. They're just not, they're not reliable. They were installed by who knows who. Just don't. And in fact, if you notice on my Polish here, I removed the safety. Now this is one of the earlier Polish imports where the safety did come in from Poland, but I just pulled it off. It was only held on by a little E-clip. And that's perfectly legal to do. Once these get imported with a safety, it doesn't matter if they get pulled off once in the USA. I do plan to get a little rod and put it in there, JB Weld or something simple, and machine it flush and put a little cold blue. And I've seen people do that with these, and they look great. You can really get them looking back to original. Romanian guns and the later Polish guns will have a much larger safety here, kind of about small finger sized. But they're still great guns, and you can still get the Romanians for well under $300, and they usually come with a holster and extra mag. And they're really interesting pieces of Russian and World War II history. I mean, even if, for example, this one made in the 50s didn't serve in World War II, it's made the same as a World War II gun, which is pretty neat. It'd be like buying a Webley or a 1911 made after the war, same design. Well, this is kind of part one. We'll do a second part covering Makarovs and other guns, so stay tuned for that in a few weeks. If you have any questions, please post them below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.